So maybe not as exciting an announcement, but hey, I look forward to it, that's for sure. Joanne Tomasello is going to open us in prayer. And Joanne, may you please lead us faithfully, and then you will introduce Dr. McKee.
Yes, can you hear me all right?
We hear you great.
Great. Let us open together with prayer. God of majestic mountaintops and serene valleys, nothing is outside of your great vision for us. You are the sovereign God who weaves together our lives into a beautiful tapestry for your glory. Keep our hearts moving in the rhythm of your grace, so that we may see more clearly your purposes for us in a broken world. In Jesus' name and life we pray. Amen.
Amen. That was beautiful.
Now it is my pleasure on behalf of the Christian Formation Committee to introduce once again Dr. Patricia McGee, who is with us from Manassas Presbyterian Church and has an extensive background and education in history and theology. She has led us through an inspiring and meaningful view of the crucifixion through art. We are most grateful for her time with us today and look forward to this morning's presentation. Dr. McGee.
Thank you. That was lovely. That was lovely. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I'm excited about looking at a couple of images that you'll be interacting with at the National Gallery. I've got my little pointer today, and I can do fun things with it if I plug it actually into the computer. So, we'll be looking at two very different images. One that is extremely kind of, I would call it celebratory and victorious, I think of when I see this painting. The other will be the Gruenwald, and it very much is one of those that is grounded in suffering. So two very different images, and that serve very different purposes. And we'll talk about what's the purpose of an image and how it functions in part today. I want to do a little bit of review. One of the things that I pointed out last time was that part of the anxiety around death and suffering in the Middle Ages was one that was grounded in the Bible. The use in particular of the text from Matthew that then gives us an image of a suffering Christ, an image of a suffering Christ that Christ actually speaks. And so when we're thinking of encountering God, one of the theological claims that Christ offers us is you encounter God in the particular when you help the stranger, the naked, the hungry, the thirsty, the imprisoned, the sick. This is scandalous, frankly, that one would encounter God in this way. In most other religions, God is not these things. God is victorious. God is all-powerful. God is magnificent. And of course, the Christian God is those things as well. But the paradox is this, and Jesus tells us, especially in Matthew, that when you do attend to these people, there will be a reward. When you do not attend to these people, there will be a punishment. And this is taken very seriously by the medieval preachers. This is preached and taken seriously and lived out. And so you don't necessarily have an obsession with death. What you have is an obsession with, how do I get my life right before I die? How do I make right my ways? How do I make straight my path before I pass on? And then I brought you this image to kind of bring that home. When a couple of things here to remember. Remember that the crucifixion did not stand alone in and of itself. It always stood as part of the narrative of the Passion. And so in this image in particular, you have a crucifixion followed by the resurrection. So you must give meaning to the suffering. And the meaning of the suffering is that it is ended. It is, Christ is the victor over that. And you see the risen Christ in the second panel as a consequence of the crucifixion. I'd like to pull another text that I think is important, and it's Romans 6. So if you could go ahead and turn to Romans 6.
Page 1028.
So Romans 6, and let's just start with the beginning of that chapter. I'll start reading and then I'll have someone kind of pick up for me. What then are we to say? Should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who died to sin go on living in it? Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Let me pull you closer into that text. Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Paul is saying, in part, when you are baptized, there is a paradoxical moment in a sense. You are baptized into new life. At the same time, you are dying. Your life of sin is dying. So life and death happen in the same moment, in the baptismal moment. Therefore, we have been buried with him by baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. This text brings me to a different image. Let me just hop out of here a second. Scroll through.
Oh.
But this is an image that we looked at last week. Well, a pair of images, actually. I made the argument that the image on your left is really not a suffering Christ. We took a look at this image and found that you don't have the kind of muscular rigor mortis that you have in the image on the right. You get a sense that he is floating on this cross. His body, except for a few, places that are pointed out in the gospel text, is pretty pristine. This is what I would not call this a suffering Christ. To the extreme on the right, you have the Gruenwald Eisenheim Altarpiece. And I would say that this is the opposite end of the spectrum. This is one of the more expressive, emotionally compelling, difficult to look at. But finally, when we think about the context of this piece, hopeful. I will attach the word hopeful to this image on the right. And if we go back to Romans, This is why I think, and a lot of artists think, that this image is hopeful. So Romans 6:4, therefore we have been buried with him by baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. For if we have been united with him in a death like his, we will certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. This is the comfort. If we die to a life of sin, if sin is put to death in the way that it is here, then our hope is that we are resurrected in the way that we know Christ is resurrected. Why is this important? Why do we need to face this kind of difficult image with regard to the level of suffering that we're looking at in the image on the right? What is Paul getting at here?
Salvation.
Yes. What are we being saved from?
Our own sin.
Our own sin. And you can think, Jacob used the word symbolic a moment ago. You can think in terms of sin as being manifest in a symbolic way in how diseased and suffering that body is. That you have a kind of physical manifestation of sin. Remember, we're thinking with our medieval minds. Okay, we're not thinking with our modern minds. And we do not pigeonhole that in the same way today. But when you don't know why something is happening and God's punishment is the best answer, or human sin is the best answer. By the way, they did find out, and we'll get to it in a moment, what was causing the sickness of the people in this hospital at Eisenheim. But it still doesn't change the message here, which is there is no condition that Christ cannot overcome. There is no condition that Christ cannot overcome. And this is why you're looking at just the worst of the worst. This is an odd tangent, but I'm going to take it. When I was a teenager, I was at a local VFW, and I had won the Voice of Democracy speech contest, and I was presenting for the veterans there. And right in the middle of my presentation, the Gulf War broke out. And everything stopped and all the televisions were turned on. And I remember over the next few weeks watching war on television. Can anybody if you remember what that was like? What did we see oftentimes when they would break away and show us the war?
Scud missiles going.
And how did they do that? How did General Schwarzkopf kind of show us how war was unfolding? What did we see on our screens?
I remember infrared images of buildings blowing up.
Okay, and from above, right? Mm-hmm. So you were looking down from above. It almost looked like what? A video game. It almost looked like a video game because there was a, the television screen had a grid over it, so that you could see how buildings were being targeted, and then you would see the explosion happen from above. What are you seeing right now when they take us to Ukraine?
People.
You're seeing people
on the ground.
Destruction. Bodies.
And, I was a teenager in the 90s, and I, of course, had not seen the images that America saw during, for instance, the Vietnam conflict, the Vietnam War. But I think there is a way that images of suffering and violence are presented to us, and the way they are presented have a direct impact on how we consume them. So I would argue possibly that seeing this kind of video game presentation of warfare doesn't have the kind of impact that seeing real person-to-person human stories does. And I think the same kind of theoretical framework is going on in these two images. You are being presented with the same scene in very different ways. On the left, I think what you have is a divine Christ whose suffering is already overcome. In the right image, you are being immersed in the suffering. There's nothing whitewashed about this image on the right. So what do you think about the function? Where do you think these images might live? Who are they for? If they're so different, they must have different functions. So there's a fancy word that art historians use. It's in situ, I-N space S-I-T-U, in the situation, right? Where might the image on the right be in situ? And we've discussed it a little bit already.
Hospital.
It's a hospital. It's a chapel hospital. It's a chapel hospital for people with a specific disease that engulfed their bodies in the way that it's engulfing the crucified Christ. This is a very specific image for a very specific group of people. What about the image on the left?
In a church?
Maybe.
I mean, because of the halo, in a way, it's like the whole story, you know the ending. Whereas on the right, if you say you're in situ, you're a part of it.
So on the left, what you might have is both the crucifixion and resurrection happening simultaneously.
Exactly. And it looked more willing. He was definitely a part.
That's an interesting observation. So part of what's meaningful about the crucifixion is that Christ is willing to go through this. And if someone wanted to underscore that particular theological thought, maybe the image on the left accomplishes that more effectively. So you see that the images not only tell us the story, they actually act as theologians. They actually theologize. So if we go back to the Romans text, I would say that Paul is our first great theologian. When he says something like, therefore we have been buried with him by baptism into death, skip down, for if we have been united with him in death, like a death like his, we will certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. We know that our old self was crucified with him so that the body of sin, he's speaking literally and symbolically in with the same word, right? So that the body of sin might be destroyed and that we might no longer be enslaved to sin. I would say both of these images are legitimate images of the crucifixion. They just have different theological messages to deliver for different audiences. Questions so far?
this isn't a question, but more of an observation when you were talking about the various stages of how it was imaged for us, war, and you mentioned it. And I'm thinking that after this, I say after, but this pandemic that we saw play out throughout the whole world has on some level equalized and on some level highlighted the difference in people in this situation. And so I find that seeing Ukraine from a people standpoint is a different, we have a different opening to what is away from us.
Yes. I would say not in my memory have I seen war delivered to us in this way. Again, I'm of a certain generation. And I would say that more often than not, I have to stand up and walk away from the television. I remember watching the images of war when I was a teenager, and forgive me, honestly thinking it was really cool what we could do, right? Because you're not really seeing the destruction. You're seeing an image of how a machine works, and how well oiled our military is. You're not seeing what's really happening on the ground. And this is a very different way to present what's going on. It's fascinating to me. So I want to skip down. So this on the right is Mathias Gruenwald's Eisenheim Altarpiece. Now this is not at the National Gallery, but there's an image very similar to it by Gruenwald. And that's what I would encourage you to take a look at when you're there. And we're going to look at that right now. So while the Eisenheim altarpiece is enormous, it's as, that central crucifixion image is probably as big as these two doors. This piece is about 24 inches high and 18 inches wide. So do take some time to, get as close to it as you can. I'm sure you can see the similarities. The emotion and the emotional level is high. The appeal to the suffering is high. What else do you notice about this image?
People are closer.
Okay, so I would say that this is John the Evangelist on the right, not John the Baptist. He is very close. Mary Magdalene is right at his feet. What else?
Shows people relating to it.
Okay.
As opposed to the other one, which was for the non-suffering, so you don't have to relate to it.
Okay. Yes, please do if you would like to walk up. I'm going to actually zoom in on a couple spots here in a moment.
So who is that?
Here?
Yeah.
This is Mary Mother. And this is Mary Magdalene. And this is John the Evangelist.
Well, we don't have.
What do you think of the colors?
I was just going to say, we don't have the white like we had, and I'm assuming to remind us of the sisters in the hospital.
Well, this actually was not used for, this was not in place at the hospital.
No, but the other one was.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking that completes an image of what the experience of the other one.
There are lots of things going on in that Eisenheim altarpiece that point directly to what's going on at the hospital. For instance, in one of the panels, there are herbs and plants that were being used to create poultices to treat the patients. There's an image of Saint Anthony, which was the patron saint of that particular hospital, and his suffering. There are all kinds of things related specific to that hospital. Now, this is a smaller image, 24 by 18, probably in someone's domestic chapel is what they're thinking. They're not sure, but they think the size of it would be a more personal use. So a small chapel, or even when you're in a big cathedral and you're walking down the side aisles, you see all these little side chapels. They think that this was either used in a side chapel or in a domestic situation at home.
Seems like they're in a garden or something.
The eclipse is being imaged here. So that's why you see the night
Dark
sky. So the eclipse is being imaged here. So the covering, the sun being eclipsed. And so that's why you see the dark sky and a few images of starlight in the background. I find the colors to be so strange. There's something so unbelievably vibrant about the coloring of the garments. They are just almost like day glow. They are so bright. And Christ, in comparison, is so green, so lifeless, so just nothing. I think that what Gruenwald is saying to drive it home, and this is hard for us, that the man on this cross is dead. He is really, truly dead. And so the fact that he is then resurrected is not magic. It wasn't like he was almost dead, or it's not that he was resuscitated. No, he was resurrected. One thing that I found interesting, you'll see a lot of brightly colored paintings from this era. And oftentimes what the artist is attempting to do in a kind of, you've got this really rich blue, then this bright, almost crimson magenta, and then the red and the blue on John. This kind of alternating of very bright, vibrant colors was a way for them to animate the image so that your eyes are moving not across a kind of consistent color palette, but your eyes are moving across a very varied color palette so that there's more movement, frankly, that's being kind of communicated through the alternating of different colors. Comparatively, when you think of German painting, French painting, Italian painting, and you will see this in the National Gallery, far less attention has been paid to German painters. Part of this is due to 2 world wars and destruction of so much artwork. Part of it is due to, frankly, the attitude toward Germany as a nation over the last century. But I would say over the last 30 years or so, there's been a resurgence in attention paid to these German painters, and Gruenwald is considered up there with a Dürer. So one of 2 or 3 German painters who really are the masters of these different styles in this era. Okay, Now for something, I won't say completely different, but different. It just feels like you still have the crucified Christ, but there's just something uplifting about this.
It's almost decorative.
It is very decorative. In fact, the painter or someone in the painter's workshop went in and did punch work into the actual surface to create texture. So you see some punch work around maybe the halos or in the mail of the chain mail on the soldier. Tell me about, let's focus on just what painters call the ground of this painting. In some of the paintings, you've seen hillsides in the background, you've seen the night sky, you've seen Jerusalem. What is in the background here for the most part?
Gold.
Gold, 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 gold. This is a borrowing from the Byzantines. The way that Byzantine painters would point out to you that what you're looking at is something divine is by giving you a gold ground. Whereas, you know, we're in a room right now, we're mere mortals. We have tables and chairs and walls and doors, but divine entities lived as if in a different atmosphere, in the ether. And so you have this gold ether surrounding these holy images. What is different here? There are so many things, but I think the thing that I want to draw your attention to here is the painter's obsession with getting the narrative, putting the narrative together for you as a person reading this image from left to right. What I learned is at this moment in time, let me see if I can pull up the actual dates. Here we go. So we're just a bit later. I'm sorry, a bit earlier. You have the beginnings of painters starting to want to what is called historicize the Passion, putting it in the historical narrative that is presented as it is presented in the Bible. So the crucifixion is happening in the course of other events. A fuller narrative is being presented here. This is also an altarpiece. So if we're moving from left to right, you have the agony in the garden. And you have bits of text being pulled in from Luke. So Luke talks about Jesus being so agonized that his sweat was like blood. And so you see blood droplets on his skin. In the background, what you have is the scene of them coming to arrest. So Judas is, get my pointer here. Here it is. There we go. So Judas is right here coming to arrest Christ. There are different vignettes going on in the center panel. The crucifixion, of course, is taking place. But what is the vignette that this centurion is portraying for us?
Where?
Right next to Christ. He's got his hands in a prayer and he's got the halo. What is the vignette from the Bible that's being portrayed here?
Oh, I don't remember that.
The centurion who looks up and says,
Truly, this is the Son.
truly, this is the Son of God. So you have that small vignette taking place. What about the thief on the left? What's happening here from the biblical text?
It's going to be seen in heaven today? No.
Yes, so he has been forgiven by Christ, and in order to kind of give that expression, a baby version of him is being pulled out of him by an angel and ascending to heaven. I mean, when you don't have the text in front of you, how in the world do you communicate this to the viewer? And so I think these are genius ways that the painter is trying to communicate to someone who doesn't have the text, who maybe can't read. And oppositely, you have the thief who mocked Jesus with what looks like a dark demon hovering over him. So you have that vignette. In your far right corner, in the lower register, what are these guys doing?
They're casting lots.
They're casting lots for the garment. I mean, look at all of what's going on here. It's the crucifixion and all of the adjacent vignettes to it that are being included. Now, on the right is Christ descending into hell. This is in the Apostles' Creed. I can't remember whether it's in the Nicene Creed. But where do we get that? Not in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. If I remember correctly, there's an apocryphal text. Nicodemus is a witness and has a gospel. And in that text, you have expressly that Christ descends into hell. And that's where the Apostles' Creed gets its formulation for that piece of it.
Are they just trying to account for the 3 days? That in between what's going on, assuming there's something very powerful that continues?
Yes. I mean, sometimes we know when these altarpieces are complete and sometimes we don't. This may have been a part of a larger piece that would then move on to show the resurrection. But if you think about the humans involved from left to right, I think part of what you're being told as the viewer is you are a sinner just like everyone in each of these panels, even those who are waiting in limbo and have descended already. And when Christ is resurrected, they too will be also. So in a sense, you do have a contained 3-part story here that has to do with you, really. And you often don't see it, or we often think it doesn't exist, but here is an actual image of God the Father.
The little red one Is that what that is?
Right here?
I see your pointer. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that it's in the first one as well.
This is being, it's interesting with the colors being the same. I'll have to do a little more research, but I believe this is an angel. I mean, he is winged, and this guy does not have wings.
And if the viewer is to have been then captured by the scene,
Mm-hmm.
there are viewers who will cast lots. There are viewers who will faint with, oh my God. And there are viewers who, upon his death, will feel themselves in hell until more story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because you talked about people that can read or not read, but you're not really talking about learning for the first time.
Sure, sure.
And so for some, hearing the story for the first time,
Mm-hmm.
this is like, oh my God, literally.
Yes, yes. I can't imagine what it would have been like to be presented with these images as someone who knew nothing about the story of Christ. Now think about this in relation to missionary work. Like, so we're thinking around like 16th, 17th century colonizers going into tribal villages and using images to teach the story. Probably nothing like this, but how do you make a lucid narrative out of images so that the people who don't know your language, don't know this story, have no cultural system like yours, it must be just, well, I think of, you remember the movie from I believe the 80s called The Mission with Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons.
Mm.
If you haven't seen it, it needs to be on your top 5. But it follows the story of the conquistador and the missionary.
Oh, yes.
Going to a village and really racing against time to Christianize the village so that they won't be enslaved. I mean, that was the game that was played. The conquistador, if he got there first, he could take them as slaves because, quote unquote, they weren't human. But if the missionary got there first and converted them to Christianity, then they were fully human and the conquistador could not enslave them. But the opening of the movie shows one of the missionaries tied to a cross with a crown of thorns on his head and then being pushed over the falls of the river. Because as the narrative was being presented to the villagers, they thought this is what he wanted for himself. So the villagers did this to him, thinking this is what he wanted. I mean, when you don't have language, this is all just fascinating to me. What is also interesting about this, and you alluded to it earlier, it is very decorative. Look at the very top register of this painting. What do you see?
You mean like the arches?
The arches. Where do we see arches like this? These are architectural, they're meant to, mirror architectural forms. It's the church. So one thing that's being said by the decorative features at the top of these panels is that this is the work of the church. This is how this continues. It's being framed as part of the narrative of the church itself. So tell me a little bit about the difference between Gruenwald's Christ and Vani's Christ.
Mm.
In Grunwald, you have to look at Christ. I mean, you just have to look at that figure. You can't keep your eyes away from it. In this one, you see everything else first, at least.
Okay.
Because of the color, because of the movement, there's so much going on. And then eventually you say, oh, look back there.
Mm-hmm.
There it is.
Mm-hmm.
So it's.
This really drives home the point that it is part of a narrative.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Protestants often err on the side of thinking that the crucifixion is something that stands alone and it's horrifying and terrorizing. And we kind of, we reel back from it. But when you see it in this way, it is just one part of the larger story. And I will argue, like I did last time, that this is the way the medievals saw it as part of the larger story. Yes, there were devotional practices around the crucifixion in particular, but unless it is contextually understood as part of the story of Christ's life, ministry, crucifixion, and resurrection, it loses its meaning. And so it has to be part of the larger story. What else is different about the body in particular?
It's like it's covered with, it's like this, like with something thin.
The body is not distended. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, and the figures, all three, Christ and the two thieves, their features are animated. The Christ looks like he's blessing the people below him. The thief who's going to heaven is looking really surprised and happy. And the one who isn't is looking quite distressed, but they are particularly animated. I also want to ask you, is this unusual to see the hair being auburn? I can't recall other crucifixion pictures where all three of them have auburn hair. No one else in the painting does.
I think when you really begin to look at the wide variety of medieval images, you see all manner of different things. You see different hair colors, you see different eye colors. Image that I am very familiar with, for instance, is the clean shaven Christ. There are dozens of those out there, and we just don't come across them very often. And so I think when you start to really look at the breadth and depth of religious imagery, it's not necessarily the case that this is an anomaly, that red hair would be an anomaly. I just think it's a variation.
He's green and monochromatic, kind of.
Yes.
With the exception of his hair and his thin, and his arms are so thin. I mean, it's almost like live, almost like a dancer in the way his body is, as was already stated, not straight out, but yeah, bended at the knee. And
mm-hmm.
What does that mean? And
so,
of course, everybody else is so full of color, like they got the memo of what to wear. And
well, when you actually stand in front of this painting, and you'll have a chance to, the thief on Christ's left, our left, and Christ are the same color because they are both dead.
okay.
The thief on the right is still alive. He's still suffering. What a theological statement to make for a human being, the thief on the left, who is a sinner, who asked for forgiveness, who was forgiven, who is being raised from the dead or taken up into heaven. And then the thief who mocked Christ being punished on the right. These are, simplistic reward and punishment categories. But I would say that they are biblical categories also.
But I remember having read about crucifixions when they were taking too long to die, as the person in there is, and they're breaking his shins with that.
Yes. Thank you. The way that they would hasten death, if they needed to, is that they would take a club to someone's legs and break them to get it to bleed out, basically. And so that is a vignette that's also in the text, that the legs were broken. And so you have yet another vignette being dramatized here in this image. All of these things did not happen simultaneously, even though they are being dramatized to be happening simultaneously, because the painter is wanting to get as much of the historical text in the painting as he can. And it is said, in clumsier hands, this would be a totally chaotic scene. It doesn't feel like chaos to me. It feels ordered in some way. There's a lot going on, but it doesn't feel chaotic to me. I think one of the reasons it doesn't feel chaotic is because there's some symmetry in this painting. If you look at the cross and you look at the angels, and also your eye kind of moves in a circle. You look at the two horses are symmetrical facing each other. So there's some little tricks, technical tricks that the painter is using to keep it ordered so that it's not just a big mess. Also, borrowing from the Byzantines is why you have that odd kind of unreal, nobody's human body looks like that, right? This is a more abstract Christ. When you look at Byzantine painting versus even early Renaissance, you see a move toward naturalism. This is not a naturalistic Christ. Almost no images of sacred people, saints, Christ, God, biblical characters were painted in a naturalistic fashion because they are not like us. Why would Christ look like us? He's not like us. The paradox is there that, yes, he's human on the cross suffering, and yet you look at him and you don't look like that. So he's also divine at the same time. One of the things that, when we look at these kind of abstracted images, we think of it as a less than, or a less sophisticated painting technique as opposed to Renaissance painting. We've kind of thrown that out. What you actually see here is a very sophisticated choice. I would say that these Byzantine painters probably could paint in a naturalistic fashion. They are choosing to paint him in this way to communicate that he is different from us.
What about the four little angels? Those are dark, and the others are, and one over the forgiven thief.
Right.
Those are in gold. Is there any symbolism?
I don't,
or anything there?
I don't know. The one thing that art historians are bad at is analyzing color.
Oh.
It's like one of the last things we talk about. And it's, in religious painting, it is terribly important. But it's often one of the last things on our list. And so I would love to know if there's some symbolism. They are actually kind of a royal blue.
Yeah, they're not black like that.
Yes. So it may be that he is a king, and that blue, that purpley blue color is attended to him because he is the King of Kings. It could be something like that. And that was true in the Byzantine era, that purplish blue was a royal color.
Yeah, Mary has them.
Well, I hope this gives you some context and some ways to kind of approach these two paintings. I hope you get to spend some time with them. The reason we didn't have time to do this, but the reason I had Jacob pull up the National Gallery website, something has happened in the last 20 years that is a boon to the whole art historical field. Every major museum in the world has put their collections online. And this is great. You can go and look at this and zoom into it, probably closer than you won't be able to get up to it at the museum, because of course they have, you can only get so close to a painting. Secondly, some of the entry summaries on these paintings are brilliantly written. And they give you information that you don't get with just the little placard, right? So I highly recommend taking a look, especially the Gruenwald isn't covered as deeply as this one is, but the entry for this painting, the Andre Boni painting, there's an extensive entry that's very informative and very helpful. If you want to know more about Gruenwald, I would actually go to the museum, I believe it's in Cologne, that has the Eisenheim piece to read more about Grunwald and what his style was and the choices he made, because they don't have a lot about him on the the National Gallery site. They actually do refer you to other sources, frankly. But the entry on this painting that's up right now is extensive and very well written and very helpful. And that goes for most of their major works of art. They have these excellent entries on the website. Questions? Questions out there in the ether?
Would you comment on it looks like flags, like maybe they're in the one on the far right. Are those like for a crusade or something?
Oh, yeah.
With the red cross on the white background?
So there is a whole genre called Crusader Art, where different aspects of the Crusades are imaged. And I would not put this in that category. That flag. Does anybody know which flag we're looking at on the right? That's a real question. It may be the Holy Roman Empire flag. It may be the German flag.
I want to say it's Swiss.
Opposites, yeah. Color opposite.
So I would have to do some research and find out about the flag. What else?
Well, going back to the central image, I'm fascinated by the compassion shown to Mary there on the left, and the evil behavior of those on the right.
Yes.
Yeah, so yeah.
Yeah, I think that, I think that painters worked with the dualism that's present in the biblical texts.
Right.
And just use that to their advantage to help what is called narrative legibility So how well is the painter helping us read this painting? And I think by giving us a kind of dualism that's pretty apparent in this painting, we are able, even as medievals who maybe didn't know how to read, to make out that there is a way of sin and a way of God. Does that make sense?
Yes.
It was pointed out that this might be hospital kind of flag.
It might be a hospitaller or a, you know, because he's attending to those that are in purgatory, that'd be interesting to see if there is something that has to do with the particular brotherhood that were hospitallers. He's coming to their aid. Don't you love the little evil guy that he's stepping on? I love the representations of evil because sometimes they're actually cute. I mean, he's a little furry, wolf-looking guy, and he's being stepped on. That was a favorite trope, that these, you know, they're stepped on by Mary Magdalene, they're stepped on by Jesus, they're stepped on by Mary, Mother of God. So you have him being squished by Jesus here.
Excuse me. This has been fabulous. I got to run down to church.
Thank you.
What about the one on the right in the blue? He seems to have that halo above his head.
That is John the Baptist.
Oh, that's
right. He's got the crazy.
No.
John the Baptist is in the far right lower corner.
Yeah.
And he's blue like water, you know? So yeah, I think color is an interesting place that art historians haven't spent a lot of time around. In fact, my dissertation advisor many years ago, I would ask her color questions. And she is Bulgarian. Patricia, I don't care about color. I don't care. But she and I had talks about that. She said, yes, it is a widely untapped area. A lot of research could be done on color, not in just religious paintings, but to find out, you know, the different codification of color and what different colors meant for all kinds of paintings.
Yeah, that would be interesting.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been great.
Thank you, Dr. McGee. We really love hearing from you.
I love being here. I don't get to talk about this stuff very often anymore.